Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from Vienna, Austria. Welcome to our first online briefing of the year 2023. This briefing is part of a series where we're discussing important topics related to nuclear disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. My name is Benedikt Sanzinger of the Multilateral Dialogue of the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation. Together with our cooperation partner, Atomic Reporters, I'm pleased to welcome today's speaker, Ambassador Jarmo Viinanen. Good afternoon. He's Ambassador for Arms Control at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. He was the head of delegation at the 10th NPT Review Conference in August 2022. And now he's chair-designate of the first session of the preparatory committee. I would also like to welcome today's moderator, Tariq Rauf. He's a member of the board of directors of Atomic Reporters. He's former head of verification and security policy, alternate head of NPT delegation at the International Atomic Energy Agency. In that capacity, he was responsible for relocating the first session of the NPT PrepCom to Vienna from New York, starting in 2007. He was a member of the Eminent Persons Group for Substantive Progress on Nuclear Disarmament, convened by the Foreign Minister of Japan. Today's discussion will examine the first session of the PrepCom, which is scheduled to be held here in Vienna from 31st July to 11th August 2023. One technical remark: this webinar will be recorded and uploaded on our website and YouTube channel. Please keep your audio and video sources turned off, and please submit the questions and comments through the Q&A function. The moderator will select or summarize questions to the speaker and will try to accommodate all questions, time permitting. Without further ado, I will hand over to today's moderator, Tariq Rauf, who will duly introduce our guest speaker. Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Benedikt, and I too would like to join in welcoming Ambassador Jarmo Viinanen for taking the time out from his busy schedule during his short visit here in Vienna to join us for this 1 hour of discussion on the upcoming first session of the preparatory committee, as you mentioned, Benedikt, that will be held here in Vienna later in the year. So just to add to what Benedikt said, the views expressed in this discussion are those of the speakers and of the audience and not of the organizers. As was already mentioned, the 10th NPT Review Conference was much delayed from 2020, but was finally held in August at the United Nations in New York last year. And despite the best efforts of the conference president, Ambassador Gustavus Laavinen, the review conference unfortunately ended without being able to adopt a final document. However, in the last week of the review conference, Ambassador Viinanen was requested by the president to hold informal consultations to try to coalesce states parties on recommendations on nuclear disarmament, particularly. After intensive negotiations conducted at the Finnish mission in New York, Ambassador Viinanen was successful in submitting a text to the president. For details on some of these, you can look at our last discussion where Ambassador Viinanen was present along with Ambassador Gustavus Laavinen, held on the 13th of October 2022, and you can do the search on YouTube, the 10th NPT Review Conference, Conference Assessment, and looking forward to 2026. I'm pleased to note that Ambassador Viinanen follows distinguished predecessors from Finland in dealing with the NPT. Indeed, at the very first NPT Review Conference in 1975, Swedish delegate Ilkka Mäkipenkki made quite an impact there in helping the chair of the review conference to reach a successful outcome, just as the review conference was on the verge of failure. Later, several distinguished predecessors of Ambassador Viinanen took part in the PrepComs and review conferences, and I had the pleasure of working with most of them, and I look forward to working with Ambassador Viinanen as well. Now, the president of the review conference, as the final document was rejected, he then gavelled in a decision on the next review cycle that inter alia called to establish a working group to review the strengthened review process for the treaty. Ambassador Viinanen will chair this working group, which was supposed to meet for a week in May, but given some objections, this date was postponed, and we are looking forward for the announcement for new dates. Now, the chair-designate's task has been elaborated in Decision 1, which was adopted at the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference, that inter alia notes that the purpose of the preparatory committee meetings would be to consider principles, objectives, and ways to promote the full implementation of the treaty, as well as its universality, and to make recommendations to the review conference. In 2000, we further interpreted this guidance to note that 3 sessions of the preparatory committee will continue to meet for a duration of 10 working days each, and that in each PrepCom session, there would be allocation of specific time to address specific relevant issues identified by the states parties, and that each session of the PrepCom should factually summarize its discussions and proceedings in a report of the chair, and the final recommendations be made in the 3rd or last session of the PrepCom. However, one of the tasks before Ambassador Viinanen at the opening of the PrepCom is to get agreement on the agenda, the working methods, the rules of procedure, and if possible, the dates for the next 2 sessions in 2024 and 2025. Now, as I was closely involved with the strengthened review process earlier on, I'm a little bit concerned about what this working group will end up doing, and we will explore some of these items with Ambassador Viinanen. So my first question to Jarmo is, would you concur that based on current expectations, the PrepCom should be able to adopt the standard agenda, program of work, rules of procedure, and working methods on the 31st of July when you convene the PrepCom here in Vienna?
Thank you very much, Tarek, for the very nice introduction, and thank you very much for organizing this event. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event, and it's a delight to share my views on the many of the issues for this very important treaty and the review we have just once again embarked on. Concerning your question, this is the expectation. We expect, of course, that when the PrepCom is going to convene in the end of July or the last day of July for 2 weeks, so the traditional agenda, work program, and so on certainly would be adopted once again. This is the basic assumption, and we go from that assumption, and let's hope that things are going to turn out as expected.
Okay, thank you. So as you have attended already a number of NPT meetings, you're aware that a number of working papers and national reports shall be submitted to the PrepCom. In designing the strengthened review process, we had envisaged that in the PrepCom under specific issues, discussions could be scheduled on discussing these working papers and national reports under each of the 3 clusters. And for the audience, the 3 clusters of the NPT are nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and cooperation in peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And so in particular for cluster 1, which is on nuclear disarmament, is it your preference or intention to try and promote or encourage discussion of the reports or working papers presented by the 5 nuclear weapon states?
Yeah, that's a very good question, which I don't have a clear answer at this stage. As you know, Tarek, very well, so the structure on the different pillars of the treaty, this is how the discussion is structured. We always start with the general debate, and then we have cluster discussions on nuclear disarmament, on non-proliferation, and peaceful uses. And of course, the purpose, of this discussion is that, and the debate is once again twofold. That the delegations actually lay out the preferences for the whole review process on the political issues which we have on the agenda on all of the 3 pillars of the treaty. At the same time, it's very important that the other delegations actually are listening to what the others have to say, and in order to be able to react on those priorities throughout the review process in a way that there would be a common understanding. What are the common priorities? What should be done to implement the treaty as a full, and so on. Whether we are going to have a discussion on the national reports of the nuclear weapon states, once again, I'm not sure whether they are going to provide the reports exactly at this point of time. But I would be very sure that the nuclear weapon states are at least going to present their whatever they feel are pertinent to the treaty, and certainly if they are going to have the reports, so they're going to present them. Once again, how that's going to happen, whether there's going to be different sessions concerning that and so on, it's too early to say.
All right, thank you. So also in the last review cycle, there were proposals to hold expert panels modeled on the experience of the open-ended working groups on taking forward nuclear disarmament held in Geneva that led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Along with others, I too was invited to make a presentation to the OEWG, but there were very few questions addressed to, quote unquote, the experts, and states basically resorted to reading national statements. At the 2018 PrepCom, the chair, Ambassador Bugalski of Poland, arranged an expert panel, especially on nuclear disarmament matters, but given the objections of some of the nuclear weapon states, this could not be done during the time of the PrepCom or the Cluster 1, but as a lunchtime side event. And since then, my views have evolved that these expert panels, I think, should be held, but held as a side event rather than during the time of the PrepCom itself. So what are your views regarding the utility of such expert panels, and would you support side events of expert panels?
I don't have a specific view whether it would be side events or whether it would be in the allocated time to the actual meeting of the preparatory committee. That's of course in the end for the PrepCom to decide and the states parties to decide on the matter. What we are lacking certainly very much in the debates in the NPT PrepComs and the NPT meetings as such is that very often it's very one-sided. I mean, it's statements, as you said, read statements in a way, and the interaction is very much lacking there. I don't know which way we could be able to increase the interactiveness of the dialogues. It might be through the expert panels in a way that there's going to be more interactive debates. There might be some other ways to do it in a way. And this has partly to do also with the, how do I say, the different delegations are in different situations. When we speak about, for example, nuclear disarmament and issues concerning nuclear disarmament, of course, countries which possess nuclear weapons, have nuclear weapon policies, probably have participated in nuclear arms control or related discussions and so on. So they probably have a knowledge-based advantage to the delegations, which might be much smaller, don't have the resources to participate in a way. So this makes sometimes an interactive debate also difficult. So if the panel discussions have been stale, if they haven't produced the products which have been wished for, I think this is one of the reasons that we come from very different knowledge base, and our understanding of the issues is just on a very different level. Once again, what would be valuable for the whole review process, which would be valuable for the whole treaty, is of course that we can increase the interactiveness in a way that we are not just repeating our statements, making our statements, but there would be interaction in a way that we would better understand why certain things seem to be impossible for certain countries to do, and why certain countries are pushing forward for those demands. This would be, of course, the goal in any of the meetings, but once again, I guess we have to be realistic. This is not going to happen overnight, and it depends, of course, altogether on the willingness and the ability of the states parties.
Thank you. Those are very valid and excellent points that you raised about the difference in the knowledge base and experience of different delegations. And therefore, it's always a challenge to have this interactive discussion. And as you would have noted in the last review cycle, particularly in the last PrepCom in 2019, the discourse actually deteriorated and became quite undiplomatic, with a lot of attacks, both on the chair and among the delegates. So I think it's important to maintain this diplomatic decorum, and states can agree to disagree, but there's no need to be rude or aggressive in the deliberations. So I hope you will be able to send that message to keep the discourse at a diplomatic level, and countries can have vigorous disagreement, but keep it civilized.
Yeah, of course, we all hope for that. It is clear that many of the issues pertaining, once again, to the implementation of the NPT, there are big political differences and big political interest involved altogether. And it's clear also that these difficulties or the disagreements, it takes a lot to overcome those. And probably some of the issues, it's very important or very difficult to overcome at all. At the same time, it's very important that we engage in a constructive manner. We have to be able to ask questions. We have to be able to ask further questions on things in a way. And we have to also respect the responses and whatever is going to be said in a way, in a professional manner. Even if we wouldn't be able to overcome certain differences of view. Anyway, the interaction can have a value if that increases the understanding of the standpoint of the other party in a way, because that can then further on create foundations for the possible compromise later on those matters.
Yeah, I think that's a very good message to send to the states parties. Staying with substantive issues, of course, we say that the three pillars of the NPT are equal, but I think more states seem to have concerns about, in particular, Pillar 1. And you would have noticed that in previous review conferences, we have used terms like nuclear risk reduction, strategic stability, undiminished security for all, but there is no definition of these terms. So how would we know whether nuclear risks have increased or decreased, whether strategic stability is improved or has deteriorated? And finally, what do we understand by undiminished security for all? So I'm not asking you to define these terms, but I think what I'm trying to suggest is that perhaps in the interactive discussion, we try to discuss so that there is a common understanding of what we are talking about.
Yeah, that's probably the purpose, that we would understand what we are talking about. And if we, for example, speak about nuclear risk, what does it mean when we are reducing? I mean, I guess there's a common understanding that everybody wants to reduce the risk concerning nuclear weapons. But you're absolutely right, it's very difficult to measure exactly what is going to happen. But we can understand, of course, if there are, for example, agreements, treaties relating to nuclear risk reduction, and you can see that parties are committed to those treaties and actually implement them treaties. So I guess the basic assumption is that those also lessen the nuclear risks. So even though there wouldn't be a clear common definition and understanding on the contents of certain terms, there can be an understanding that certain measures are in the interest of all of the states parties. Strategic stability certainly is also a very difficult term. I mean, there are different definitions, once again, on those matters, but basically it's a question about that the risk for nuclear use is lower than it used to be before if the strategic stability is increasing. Undiminished security, once again, I wouldn't want to go there and define it in a way, but basically my understanding is that states parties engage in nuclear or disarmament, all the disarmament measures, arms control measures, confidence building measures, in order to promote and to advance predictability, stability, and their own security interest. You engage in a process and agreement when you give up something and you get in return something that the value is a little bit more. And I guess this is the question when we speak about undiminished security. It would be unrealistic to think that somebody would give up her own security in order to promote everybody else's security. It would be a very difficult proposition, I guess, in any particular country to agree to.
Yes, that's actually a very good point that you made there. You will be chairing a PrepCom at a time where, according to most of the discussion, nuclear risks seem to have increased, and the only strategic arms control treaty left standing, New START, seems to be under some threat. So how would you intend to deal with this situation?
Yeah, I don't know whether I can deal with this situation, but it's going to be interesting how these states parties are going to deal with this matter. But you're absolutely right. These are key questions. We can see over a longer period of time that arms control as a whole, and especially nuclear arms control, is in trouble. And one states party have now suspended the implementation of the one remaining arms control treaty. And this is a negative development, of course. A negative development, I think, for those states parties to the treaty, but also everybody else. And this, once again, is about stability, strategic stability, and so on nuclear risk. At the same time, it's impossible. We can assume and say that nuclear risks are on the increase. But once again, it's impossible to measure exactly whether nuclear use, how much more probable nuclear use is today than it was a year ago, or even if it's more probable than it used to be. I mean, once again, we don't have the measurements for those things, and I don't think that we are going to be able to have them. But what is to be expected is, of course, that the issues which you raised, for example, are going to be discussed in the summer when we are going to meet in the PrepCom.
All right, absolutely. Thank you. And I think also a message to send is that arms control is not a reward to the adversary. Arms control is a part of a state's defense policy. It is risk reduction and threat reduction. And therefore, arms control has its own value in engaging the adversary, trying to get some transparency, trying to prevent further destabilizing military buildups. And therefore, it is vitally important to keep channels of discourse and negotiation open despite the deteriorating international situation.
Yeah, exactly. I would go even a little bit further. I would say very straightforward that arms control is a means to promote one's own security interests. You engage in arms control in order, as I said, with the disarmament, you give up something, you agree on something, and you get more in return. This is the basic concept in international cooperation altogether. We give up a certain amount of our own sovereignty actually in return to get something more in sovereignty and something else in return. So this is the basic concept, and it has to be there. Yes, everybody should be concerned about the state of nuclear arms control today, and everybody should urge the nuclear weapon states to engage in nuclear arms control and nuclear disarmament.
Well said. Thank you. So now I'd like to move on to the strengthened review process and the working group that will be set up. Its mandate is to make recommendations to the Preparatory Committee on measures to improve effectiveness, efficiency, transparency, accountability, coordination, and continuity of the review process. So what is your understanding of what this mandate is? And in my personal view, reopening in a big way what we agreed in 1995 and 2000 on the review process probably could open a Pandora's box or a hornet's nest of problems that we don't really fully anticipate. For example, substituting the PrepCom from 10 working days to an annual conference of 5 days, or cutting back the review conference to 3 weeks from 4, in my view, is a regression from the concept of permanence with accountability that we used in 1995 to get indefinite extension of the treaty. So your views on this?
First of all, you said in your introduction that I would be chairing the working group. This is not the case. I mean, there's no decision on the chairing arrangements concerning the working group. You were referring to the decision made in 1995, which was a landmark decision altogether for the strengthened review process, with all the things contained in the decisions at that time. I think it's about time. Now 28 years since 1995. Once again, to look up the review process, whether it can be further strengthened. There's all the reason to do that. We have heard throughout the years that some delegations, some countries, many people are complaining about the review process, that it's not somehow fit to the task, and something needs to be done at the same time about the matter. So to me, the decision to establish the working group holds a big promise. It's a possibility to make the treaty we have to function even better. It's a possibility to make the review process to function better. And this should be in all of the states parties' interest, certainly. When it comes to the substance, I mean, we are far away from having a meeting of the working group, because we have to agree on the modalities. But you mentioned the 6 words which are contained in the decision, and these are very big words, and certainly they have very different meaning for many of the delegations. So it remains to see what kind of common ground can be found on those issues: effectiveness, efficiency, transparency, accountability. I would imagine that there are going to be very different views on those. At the same time, when we have had consultations with the states parties, I wouldn't want to predict what kind of issues there are going to be on the agenda, but there are many delegations raising exactly the same concern as you are saying, that we shouldn't try to overhaul the decision from 95, but actually just to improve it in certain respect and leave the basis as there. This has been said by several delegations, and nobody has said anything else. But it's once again an issue for the states parties to see whether they can find common ground, how to make the review process more effective and more strengthened. And so let's see what will happen once we get the working group up and running.
Thank you. So in English, there's an old saying, it's a bad workman who blames his tools. So in my view, a lot of the frustration with the review process is not so much about the process. It's frustration because countries were not able to agree on the big substantive issues. And again, unfortunately, these tend to be in cluster 1. So changing the shape of the table or the format is not going to get countries to walk away from their core interests that they feel are worth defending, and they are not able to compromise on that. So that's been my experience, but let's see how this works. So a related question is that in the in the decision that was adopted on the 26th of August, it said that the working group will meet as close as possible to the beginning of the first meeting of the PrepCom. So as such, why was it proposed to hold it from the 8th to the 12th of May?
First of all, if I just say a couple of words on the shape of the table and its impact on the political issues, you're absolutely right. The disagreements and the inability to agree on an outcome document in the review process is because of the political differences we have. That is certainly true. At the same time, compared with many other processes we have in the international cooperation, so one can see that, of course, something could be done on the working methods and how things are going forward. In a way, for example, one of the criticism which is very often said is about the PrepComs, which don't actually produce anything substantive for the follow-up PrepComs or the review conference. At the same time, we can see that is certainly there's a value that we have PrepComs, the states parties come together, they make clear what are their priorities, where they would like to see more progress and so on. It has a value itself in a way, and that certainly builds up to the review conference. And then you can, of course, also say that, okay, we have a review conference which lasts for 4 weeks, and the actual negotiations on the substance, on the possible outcome document, start in a very late in the review process. We are always going to be in a hurry. We have to negotiate through the nights, and the language of the outcome documents are not always perfect, and they certainly could be improvement. So besides the political differences, so I think that there are certain things which might be possible to do with the review process in order to actually to make the whole review process better. The question concerning the as close as possible, I mean, this is a relative term, of course, in the international cooperation, and my understanding once again is it's up to the states parties to decide what is the closest possible, and certainly if there would have been agreement that the working group would be meeting in New York in mid-May, that would be the closest possible to the PrepCom. So we shouldn't get too stuck with these words in a way, because it's the states parties which are the masters of this process and the interpretation of certain things. If there's an agreement, then that's the agreement that this is the closest, as close as possible.
Okay, good, thank you. I wanted to come back to the earlier point that you made in this last intervention, the complaint that states parties have that PrepComs have not been able to agree on recommendations. But that is the fault of the states parties themselves. It's not a fault of the process. And starting with the first PrepCom after 95, which was chaired by your colleague Pasi Patokalio, states said our final position will be given at the review conference. We said, yeah, but you can say what your position is in 2023. And then at the next PrepCom, you can update your position, and then you update in 2025 in the current, and then at the review conference, you bring your final position. So there's nothing stopping agreeing what is your position in 2023, but they don't want to do it. And then they blame it on the review process. So that's my complaint. So I'm not disagreeing with you. What I'm disagreeing is what you are being told by some of the states party.
Yeah, and I'm not disagreeing with you either on this matter. Yeah. It is obvious like that. It's about political issues. It's about negotiation tactics. It's about the way all the states parties are behaving in this process. And once again, in international negotiations, you actually agree on an outcome when you absolutely need to agree on an outcome, and it's not going to happen earlier than when it's actually absolutely necessary to do it.
So that is where this issue of the reflections of the chair comes in. which is why in 1998, then Canadian Ambassador Mark Moore proposed that at every session of the PrepCom, we could have a statement on the state of our treaty, where we are. It could be an agreed statement, but that was not possible. But I'm glad that starting with the first PrepCom for the last review conference, Ambassador Henk van der Kwast did issue his chair's reflections, and then he was followed by his successors in the next two PrepComs. So my question to you is, are you considering issuing your chair's reflections, which is separate from the chair's working paper?
I'm certainly considering that, but it's too early to say whether there's going to be chair's reflections on that matter.
But that's your decision. You don't need the permission of the states parties for that.
No, I understand, but it's of course, we are now, how many months? 4 months.
4 months, yeah.
4 or 5 months away from the PrepCom. I have to confess that I haven't thought this so deeply yet, and I have to consider. This is certainly something that I will consider and certainly give a serious thought, but I cannot say today that I would produce a reflections paper.
Fair enough. So the next one is a nitpicking point. The review conference did not specify where the working group would be held. So why was New York chosen when we know that some countries now increasingly are having problems getting visas? And I hear that perhaps the working group might meet here in Vienna. And as you know, for the past 3 years, I've been trying to lobby to move the review conference from New York to Vienna because 2 of the 3 pillars are here, Pillar 2 and Pillar 3. And with CTBTO, we even have a little bit of Pillar 1. And if you haven't heard, you know, we talk in Vienna about the spirit of Vienna. It's called Gemütlichkeit, or coziness. And in the earlier strategic arms reductions between the Soviet Union and the United States, the negotiators would go for a walk in the Vienna woods, and that's where they would make some of the big breakthroughs, walking together. So I'm not suggesting you go for a walk in the Vienna woods, but if the working group is to be held here, perhaps as part of this discussion on the strengthened review process, one should also look at why not move the venue to Vienna of the review conference.
On the working group, first of all, I mean, the main issue with the UN system nowadays, with the backlog from the COVID pandemic, is that the scarcity of meeting rooms, the facilities, and also the services, interpretation and other conference services. Whenever deciding on any of the meetings, these are the first things we have to take in consideration. Can we have a meeting room? Can we have the other facilities? Can we have the interpretation? And when we can have it? And that limits the options for different meeting places immediately. When considering the working group, it was clear very soon that there was no availability, for example, in Geneva because of the renovation of the UN premises there. So that left only Vienna and New York to be decided upon. Why we were proposing New York in this respect, the main reason was exactly what you also referred to, the inclusiveness. All of the states parties to the NPT actually have representation in New York. They don't have anywhere else that representation. And this was a very important issue for many of the delegation. The majority, clear majority of the delegation preferred the working group to be held in New York. It was a problem a challenge for a couple of delegations, which they had their reasons not to agree to New York. Concerning the visa issue, the host country in New York, once again, over and over, they emphasize that they are honoring the host country requirements and provide appropriate visas in appropriate time. So that is the that is the situation where we are right now. So once again, based on the consultations I have had here in Vienna, so soon enough we have to make another proposal concerning the venue and the dates for the working group. But it's too early to say exactly what kind of proposal there's going to be. But of course, there's a clear possibility that the working group would be meeting in Vienna during the spring or during the summer.
So is my understanding correct that there will be only one meeting of the working group for 1 week, because that's what the decision said? Or will there be further meetings in the next couple of years?
Once again, this is an issue which is up to the states parties to decide whether there's going to be whether it's going to be one of or several meetings. And this issue has come forward also in the consultations. There are several delegations which are saying that there should be a continuous process throughout the review cycle in a way, and there would be a report to the review conference to actually to make the decisions for the next review cycle on the possible ways to strengthen the review. So it's too early to say once again whether it's going to be a one-off meeting, whether there's going to be a continuous process. It's up to the states parties to decide. And I think this is one of the decisions which can be made only when the working group is going to meet.
Thank you. So in New York at the review conference, I did approach a number of delegations regarding the change of venue of the review conference, and they made the same point that you just made about inclusivity and that all NPT states parties have representation in New York. And what I said back to them was that 200 countries and territories are prepared to go to Sharm el-Sheikh for the environment conference or to Glasgow. So there the issue of representation doesn't come up. So why is it that it's only in the NPT that they raise this issue of representation when they're prepared to go for 2 weeks or 3 weeks to different parts of the world to discuss the environment?
Yeah, I mean, Tarek, you have much more experience with the NPT process, and you can certainly answer that question much better. I mean, it's once again, it's up to the states parties to decide on this matter, and so far the states parties have been preferring to keeping the current system that we have 3 PrepComs, first in Vienna, then in Geneva, then in New York, and the review conference in New York. Once again, I can understand that in international cooperation, when you have such an established practice, it takes a lot of convincing to change that practice once again. But it's once again, as I said, it's up to the states parties to decide. Concerning the argument which you made once again, for example, on the environmental conferences, Sharm el-Sheikh, and so on, many of the delegations also emphasize that they have certain professionalism within their missions in New York to the United Nations, and they don't always need to have capital representation in those meetings. So that's a valid point also. But once again, as I said, it's up to the states parties to decide wherever they want to meet.
Okay, thank you. So I would encourage those who are participating online to put up their questions that we can put up to Ambassador Viinanen. It seems now that the relations between the 5 nuclear weapon states are on a downward slide. And we witnessed some of this tension at the review conference. And I think probably these tensions are getting worse. How do you envisage managing these contentious issues at the PrepCom should the tensions begin to boil over?
Probably what we saw in the review conference in New York in August is that even these 5 nuclear weapon states have something in common, especially that they are possessing nuclear weapons. But there are many differences between them. And probably we are going to see also, as we saw in August, we are going to see in the further meetings also that these differences are playing out, and they are actually making a little bit bigger number about the differences between them, and probably some of the nuclear weapon states want to differentiate themselves from the others. I think, and to me, it's natural that there are political differences between different countries. There are different interests, there are which they want to promote, and different aspirations. This is part of the international cooperation, so I'm not really concerned about that this would be boiling over in that sense. It's part of the process. This is something that has to be managed. I mean, the countries which you are referring to actually are countries which have a lot of knowledge. They have big diplomatic services. They have ample interagency cooperation in a way. I would assume that these member states parties are going to be able to articulate their positions, and their priorities in a very constructive manner also in the future.
Thank you. I think that's a very positive message to send. Nowadays, there's more and more pressure for greater involvement of civil society in international meetings, particularly in international security fora. So how can civil society engage better with the work of the PrepCom? Would it be possible to let civil society sit in throughout the proceedings of the PrepCom, even when it goes into so-called informal sessions when civil society is asked to exit the room?
Yeah, once again, I have to say it's up to the states parties to decide on this matter, and there are clear rules of procedures for the NPT which have been adapted over and over again. And once again, we all know that changing that is going to be very difficult. Once again, when you have very established rules of procedure. I mean, I know that there are some states parties which actually welcome this kind of change, and then there are some other states parties which actually want to retain the situation as it is. So I wouldn't personally be too optimistic about that it would be changing in any way. But as you said, it's very important that the civil society actually have an opportunity and possibility to engage and to contribute to the NPT and NPT review process, because that's very valuable. Some of the civil society actors actually possess knowledge, understanding, positions, and sometimes they can also craft language which is very innovative and actually would be very helpful in the negotiations. So one of the ways, of course, to further to have further impact on the review process is to have, first of all, a long-term commitment to the treaty, and then long-term commitment trying to influence the review process, to create proper connections with the delegations which the civil society actors feel might be eager to take on board certain issues which they are promoting, to develop the partnerships, to speak with the participants in the NPT review process and meetings and so on. It is the practical work which organizations which want to influence decision making are doing every day, and the civil society organizations are certainly doing this all the time. But of course, there's always a way to step up this cooperation. To my experience, once again, very often when we have diplomats coming from different foreign services, I wouldn't say that we are the most innovative bunch of people altogether, and we very often like to do things as we have done before, because we know how it's done, and if we stay in a position for 3-4 years, why would we want to change this? Because we are not going to see the benefits of that. So, but if there's going to be pressure, if there's going to be input coming from the civil society, there's a better chance that the change might take place.
Thank you. In my experience, it's sort of an uncomfortable truth. This is a broad generalization that unfortunately sometimes it tends to be the democracies, not the autocracies, that object to the presence of civil society in disarmament fora. But this is a broad generalization. And I agree with you with the other point as well, because now there are many retired diplomats who have joined civil society think tanks, and they can bring their expertise to bear as well. And I think that's a good message for serving diplomats, that their seniors or their peers who have retired are contributing to further thinking through think tanks, through universities, and so on. And so this should be considered more as a resource rather than as a threat, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, more as a resource than a threat. Yeah, I agree on that. It shouldn't be a threat, and in a way, at the same time, I understand that many states parties feel that, for example, NPT is a treaty of the states parties, and they have the responsibility for the treaty and its implementation and such. So, I mean, the roles have to be, and they have to remain very clear in this process. It's the states parties, once again, which are responsible for the implementation of the treaty.
Thank you. So we are approaching the end of our time. Would you have any final message to states parties, to our viewers, and then we can close this discussion?
Not really. It's nice to see that there are anyway 45 attendees in this. I mean, this is not the most interesting topic probably in the world, and the NPT as a whole is not something that make headlines every day, even though it's a treaty which is implemented every day, which has a huge impact on our societies and the security environment where we live all together. The more we have interest in the treaty, the better. So it's very nice to have been involved with this conversation, and I'm very delighted to see that there are so many interested people also participating in this event.
Well, thank you very much, Jarmo. Normally, we have a much larger contingent of people tuning in, so I don't know whether there were some competing events, but the fact that we will be recording this and then it will be posted on the website and the YouTube pages of both Atomic Reporters and the Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung will make it available to other people. And we will, through our outreach, also inform that this particular resource is available. And if you consider it appropriate, you might also refer people to check out this conversation that you've had with us today, which answers several of the questions that many people might have.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So with that, I'd like to thank Ambassador Jarmo Viinanen for taking the time from his brief visit and busy schedule here in Vienna. And I will return the podium back to Benedikt Zanzinger of the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation to bring this to a close. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tarek, for this excellent moderation. And thank you very much, Ambassador Viinanen, for your time and your remarks as chair-designate of the first session of the preparatory committee. Overall, especially in the last year and in light of nuclear saber rattling and uncertainties, I think the importance of providing a platform for dialogue is unbroken. And the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation, as I mentioned, civil society actor, will keep on providing those platforms. I'm therefore pleased to announce the next webinar by CAS and Atomic Reporters, which will be held on Wednesday, March 15th, where we'll be elaborate on the future of New START after Russia has announced suspension of its implementation. I would also like to thank the audience from around the world for your participation. Please visit the website of Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation and Atomic Reporters, and of course watch our YouTube channel to see the previous videos on the NPT review conference as already addressed. I wish you a pleasant rest of the day. Thank you for being with us, and I look forward to the next webinar on March 15th. Thank you very much. Keep safe and goodbye from Vienna.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.